Welcome to Chatting Shit with Ostique, the podcast series where we chat about shit with inspirational people from all walks of life. Today, we are joined by the wonderful and inspiring Ben Raybould. We hope you enjoy this conversation. Ben, welcome to Chatting Shit with Ostique.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure to have you. Today's topic is all about coping with invisible illness. We'll touch on lots of things about this, but I think this is a really interesting and important topic to touch upon. And I know you've got some really interesting points of view, so I'm thrilled to have you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Before we kind of get into the nitty gritty, I wondered if you would kindly introduce yourself and if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about your journey with Crohn's to date.
Yeah, of course. So I'm Ben, or you might know me on Instagram as Stoma Diaries. So I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease back in 2009, when I was 24. So sort of quite a typical age, I suppose, to sort of get that diagnosis. It seems to be sort of quite often early 20s really when it comes on. I'd had a period of being unwell for a while. My dad has IBS, so for quite a long time, the doctors kind of just palmed it off, assuming that it was IBS, to be honest. It's quite a long time ago now, so I can't really remember all the details. But yeah, I remember a long time of sort of, they didn't really do a lot. Fortunately, through my job that I had at the time, I was an environmental scientist for an engineering company, and I had
Oh, wow.
yeah, well, it sounds quite interesting, but I spent my time catching water voles and lizards and things and moving them from one place to another. And yeah, it sounds.
I think that's really fun.
It sounds quite fun. In some ways, it was quite fun, and others, like I wasn't using my brain, so I sort of moved into teaching eventually. But yeah, I had private healthcare through that, so I sort of went through Bupa in the end, and they were then really quick and got me diagnosed, did colonoscopies and everything, blood tests and all that kind of stuff, and diagnosed with Crohn's. Well, it's always been a bit weird, my diagnosis, but I think initially it was Crohn's disease, and then it got reevaluated to Crohn's colitis,
Wow.
and then it'd been Crohn's colitis all the way through until. Actually, I'm not 100% sure, because no one still can give me an exact answer, but I think I've now got Crohn's disease, because, as I'll get in a minute, they sort of found some of the stuff later on. So for anyone that doesn't know, essentially Crohn's colitis is Crohn's disease that just affects the colon, and then if it's Crohn's disease, then it's spread beyond the point of the colon. So yeah, I was quite unwell for a while. I'd lost a lot of weight. I mean, granted, I was quite overweight at the time. I was about 16 and a half stone or something. I was at uni, well, I'd just finished uni, and I piled the pounds on, as you do, food and beer. Yeah, so I just quite overweight, and I lost a lot. I got to the point where I was like 11 stone 7, which I'm like 6'3", so like I was gaunt, like I was grey, and you could see my ribs through my back and stuff, and I didn't look good. Lots of running to the toilet and all that kind of stuff, and pain and things. Fortunately, my symptoms were only quite mild, so they got me sorted on like steroids and things initially, and then eventually went on to pentamizine and azathioprine, and for years that was sorted and I was fine. And then I actually had this amazing period for probably about a year where I wasn't even taking anything. I even came off the Pentasa. I was literally just like,
Wow.
I was fine, like living a kind of normal life. And it took me a long time really to accept that I kind of had a place in this community, to be honest, because I felt like I kind of didn't really belong, or my story wasn't valid because I wasn't, at that point, it wasn't really severe, it wasn't massively impacting me. And with Crohn's, it all sort of comes and goes, and you get the patches of flare and remission. So I'll go through waves, and gradually they sort of using more and more steroids to sort of get that sorted, but it would work. And then around about lockdown, I think just the pressure of still teaching. I teach at an independent boarding school, day and boarding school, and we've always used technology. Like the pupils have all got, well, they used to have iPads, now they've got Microsoft Surfaces. So we were like ready to go straight away with the internet lessons and the virtual lessons and stuff. We were already kind of using everything. But it then made it quite pressured, because it was like carrying on teaching from home, but in a really different way with all the family around. I've got 2 young kids, so my youngest was a nursery actually. My oldest I think she was in reception, I think. So she was trying to learn. My wife was trying to teach her, whilst we were trying to sort of keep the younger one occupied, and I was still trying to teach. It was chaos. So I think the stress of that then set my Crohn's off even more. I think stress has always been my trigger. I think I've been quite fortunate with food. That's not really been so much that what I eat. It's been, I think, stress. And I think I internalize stress a lot as well. I don't think I sort of recognize that I am stressed a lot of the time. Um, and yeah, it just got worse. And so the urgency was getting really bad. The amount of times I was having to go into the toilet was getting really bad. The pains were getting worse. And so eventually, after courses of steroids, they got to the point where you've had too much prednisolone. We're getting a bit worried about the amount that you've had now. And so they started biologics. So at that point, I was still on Pentasa, I was still on azathioprine, and then they started me on which one did I do first? Adalimumab first. I did adalimumab first. That made no difference at all. And then I did ustekinumab, and that made no difference at all. Again, by now, colonoscopies had shown I had moderate level of disease, so still wasn't severe. And the amount of people I've now reached out to, and I know their stories and what they've gone through is so much worse than what I've had to go through. But it was still such a level that the drugs weren't working. So the consultant then described me as a primary non-responder. Basically, it was really only the steroids that were then working, and I'd had too much. So at that point, I could have tried vedolizumab, or they then brought surgery onto the table. And I was initially, I couldn't believe it, to be honest. I was because I'd had this journey of it being so mild for so long, not feeling like I even felt it. Yeah, fitted into the community, let alone sort of warranted major surgery. I didn't. I found it really hard to comprehend. But then it was like the videos at the time, because I wasn't on Instagram then. The YouTube videos from Moeed Majid and Mesha.
Right.
Their videos like got me through, and they enabled me to see that it was nowhere near as bad as kind of what I thought it might be. And Moeed's in particular were amazing because they showed the light and the dark as well, and I needed that. I needed to see it wasn't all going to be like plain sailing and easy all the time, but I needed the reality. So that enabled me to sort of say, okay, let's do it. Let's go for surgery and do that. So signed up. Then they did all the pre stuff, one of which was CT scan. And this is where things then started to change a little bit. So I was originally only going to have a defunctioning loop ileostomy, which is where they bring the end of the small intestine out and they basically kind of cut it so you end up with two holes. The bottom one's sort of supposed to sort of close up over time a little bit, and the top is where the waste comes out of. But when they did the CT scan, they found that I had inflammation and narrowing of the end of my small intestine, the ileum, which they called mild terminal ileitis. Which when I looked it up, again, it couldn't really get a clear answer. It seems to be like it can be an infection that can then cause it to do that, or it can be a sort of irritation, but it can also be a symptom of Crohn's disease. So that was a bit unclear at the time. But anyway, either way, they couldn't make the healthy stoma with that. So they then decided that because my Crohn's was, again, still probably only moderate, but literally all the way through my colon as well, that the best thing to do was go for the subtotal colectomy and end ileostomy. So did that. That went really well. I mean, obviously, it's weird. Like you wake up and you're obviously in pain, but at the same time, like this pain is gone. It was the most bizarre feeling. And again, speaking to so many people on Instagram, they've had the same thing. It's just like this.
Everybody says that.
Yeah, it's
It's
insane.
mad. It's amazing.
It is so weird. Like it's just like it's a different pain that's been replaced, but you know that this one's now
Mm.
temporary. Um, and so yeah, that went well, and I kind of recovered from that pretty well. And then I was still, so at that point I still had my rectum, and I could have had a reversal, but because when they did the biopsies on the bit of small intestine that they'd taken out, that showed that actually that was symptomatic of Crohn's. So that's where I think, hence why I've now got Crohn's disease, although they've never really given me a clear answer, but I think basically I've got
Mm.
Crohn's disease, which is not a problem as such, and in some ways not really a change, but at the same time, mentally it's left a definite worry and kind of scar in my head that it's going to come back and progress back up my small intestine or go in my mouth, my esophagus, stomach, wherever, and I'm going to end up with more problems. And I kind of just have to bear in mind what I've been through so far and think, well, even if that happens, hopefully I'll have a good few years where I can enjoy life as it is now, and I'll deal with it later like I've dealt with what I have done. So because of that, and because of there is a risk with rectal cancer with leaving the rectum in when you've still got Crohn's there. My rectum was probably my worst bit of my Crohn's anyway, and I was still getting issues with bleeding and excess mucus from my rectum. and I was just finding it annoying as well. Like I kind of didn't have to go and sit on the toilet anymore, but now I was sitting on the toilet because I had to go and pass all this
Yeah.
mucus and stuff. And the and then the worst bit, I started then getting urgency from that. So I'd sort of dealt with like urgency from when I didn't have the bag, to the point where I was having accidents and I was going to work, going to school as a teacher, standing in front of people wearing adult nappies was like inner most degrading thing I've ever kind of had to do, I think.
Mm.
And I thought I don't want to go back to that again. I've just had this major surgery, so um, that yeah, the cancer risk and the reversal not being the best option. I just thought, right, you know what? Can I do the procto? So I basically kind of elected to do the proctocolectomy surgery, which I then had that done in February. So if, yeah, not too long post-op from that, so all recovered from that now.
No.
Yeah, that takes me to now.
How's the recovery? I've got so many things I want to ask you about that you've kind of touched upon, but just quickly, what was the recovery like from that recent surgery?
Well, mine was a bit punctuated, I suppose. So the actual surgery went really well. I would say I definitely think because I was able to go into this one fit and healthy and strong, I'd sort of found the gym between recovering from the first op and then going for the second one. I'd never really been someone that goes to the gym, but I think, well, maybe we'll probably get onto that a bit later with sort of mental health and body image and stuff. Like I really found that was really
Mm.
important, but I think that definitely then meant I went into this one a lot fitter and stronger, which I think had a big positive impact on my recovery. So in many ways, I recovered pretty quick. But I had an issue where I had the internal drain. They have like a drain that goes in through your tummy. Well, again, everyone seems to be different, but mine went through my abdomen and then it went down to where my rectum
Right.
was to remove the bodily fluid and stuff. And at some point, that I was getting a lot of pain. I was like, this doesn't feel right. And they came back one day after some blood tests and said, we're a bit concerned about you've got an infection. And it turns out they did CT scans, and the surgeon came round. He's like, well, what's happened is that the tube has been, in his words, tickling your liver, which basically meant it was scratching my liver, and had then called, yes, tickling my, and I was like, that's what a lovely way of putting it. Lovely. And that basically caused like hematomas, which then are broken down into toxic substances and create this internal collection, they call it internal infection. And at that point in the recovery, I was probably about day 5 or so. So I was getting quite close to actually being discharged when then this came up. And I remember it was a doctor. It turned out later on it was a first year doctor who had come to sort of break some news to me that I had this infection and that they were potentially going to have to do a couple of things. And I remember she came in, she said, right, well, tomorrow we're going to put an NG tube into you because we think you've got ileus. We're going to recatheterize you, and then we're going to do this CT guided drain. And she left, and I just broke down into tears. I was like, I don't want any of those things. Like I felt, other
Mm.
than being not feeling great, like I did feel grotty and horrible, like I did have an infection. I didn't feel brilliant, but so I've just had the catheter out. Like I definitely don't want to have to go through the degradation as well of having a catheter put in whilst you're awake. Like it's not the nicest thing to have to think you're going to go through, let alone clearly that's going to be uncomfortable. I was dreading the NG tube from what other people have sort of said their experience of that is. And the CT guided drain did not sound nice either. So yeah, I blubbed like a baby, which I posted about on my
I would
Instagram.
have too.
Fortunately, that didn't happen in the end. I didn't have ileus, and it was all a bit confusing. But they let me go, and then I went home, and I was starting to recover quite well. And then all of a sudden, about a week and a half, 2 weeks later, every time I stood up, it was like agony. It was so painful, and it was like something was just dropping down onto my wound. And then I had one morning where I woke up, and I'd just gone for a wee, and I kind of thought, oh, this my boxers feel a bit wet, and there was just like all this horrible. God, it was disgusting, and it was like, what on earth like has happened here? I was like freaking out. I was like, oh my god. So then I sort of went back in and a bit of a faff, but eventually got readmitted to the surgical assessment unit, and they were like, yeah, your infection's come back. It's now bigger than it was before. So
Oh,
I avoided the NG tube, but I did have to be recatheterized whilst I was awake and have to have the CT guided
damn.
drain, which was yeah not the nicest of experiences. So overall, like the recovery, other than that, if you take that out of the equation, because then I was left with this stupid drain in, which was only supposed to be in for a week, but ended up being in for 3 weeks, courtesy of the hospital not requesting it on my discharge. That I needed to have it removed, and then the junior doctor's strikes as well, which then delayed stuff. So I ended up
Yeah.
having it in for 3 weeks, which was not the most comfortable of things. Whilst you're obviously already kind of a bit uncomfortable from not being able to sit on your bottom properly. Um, but yeah, it was okay. Other than that, so I think take that out. Actually, it was good and a much easier recovery than the first one. Everyone's different. I have seen one of my friends, Hannah, who's on Instagram, Ostomy Mummy, and she has had similar. Well, she had the same procedure done, and I know she's had all sorts of issues and things. And but then, yeah, everyone has got other things going on with their bodies as well as this stuff.
Yeah.
And locations of different things, how surgeons do things differently. There's all sorts of different aspects.
Tons to say apart.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, everyone's experience is different, I think. Yeah.
I'd really love to touch a little bit upon why you didn't feel a part, or that you were kind of entitled to be a part of the IBD community when you were kind of in the throes of your Crohn's or Crohn's colitis at the time. What can you like unpack that a little bit for me? What made you feel that way, and how did you, I guess, eventually overcome that?
I think I think to a large extent, like I sort of followed Crohn's and colitis a bit on Facebook, but that was the only social media that I had. I'm a little bit older, and I think some of the social media until this had kind of bypassed me. Like I wasn't interested in Instagram and TikTok, and it just wasn't really on my radar. So I didn't have access to a lot of people that had it. But then I think and I love Crohn's and Colitis UK. I think they do a fantastic job, and I think they're getting better and better and better at broadcasting
Mm.
different types of stories. But at the time, back 2009, 2010, the only thing that was in the news or that Crohn's and Colitis would talk about were like the big worst case scenarios, the people that have been like at near death, it's nearly killed them, or they've been such a bad way and they've had emergency surgery. And that wasn't me. And so,
Yeah.
because I didn't have that community to reach out to, I didn't have someone else I could bounce off that was in a similar situation, or at least I had parity that I could kind of talk about. And all I
Yeah.
saw at the time was like really bad situations. I didn't connect to it, I suppose. So it was only really when I was preparing for the surgery and say watched Moeed's stuff and Mesh's stuff that enabled me to see that there was actually this community out there. I just didn't know it existed. And then finding it and seeing what was there and what other people were doing sort of really inspired me to try and give back like the videos that I'd used to help me get through. And yeah, I mean, it's a bit addictive as well. So I think my wife gets a bit annoyed at how much time I spend on it. I have to sort of rein it in a little bit, but no, I've really enjoyed being there, and yeah, being part of that community has helped me to see that everyone's story is valid, and it doesn't matter where you are in that process or what level of severity. It's an unfair hand that we've been dealt to have to go through this, and the impacts that having IBD, whatever form you've got and whatever severity, is significant, and it's something that people need to be aware of. Yeah.
I totally agree. And I know this sounds really cliche, but representation matters. It's important that you're able to see yourself reflected in as many places as possible to make sure that you don't feel so alone. I mean, that's why we do this podcast, to make sure that people can tell their stories. And we know it helps other people just to hear them. So thank you for sharing yours.
Oh no, you're welcome.
You briefly alluded to kind of mental health and how that might be impacted by either suffering with Crohn's or actually post surgery, potentially for some people. Um, you talked about being a teacher, which is something else I wanted to talk about. And I guess this is maybe kind of all wrapped up in the same thing and needing to kind of wear adult diapers and things. But how do you think, if at all, your mental health has been impacted by your illness? And how did it potentially affect your career as well?
Okay, so I mean, it's varied at times. I think, all those years where I was basically kind of in remission or in minor flares, it was fine. It wasn't, I knew it was part of my life, but it didn't really affect me too much. So I suppose really it's only been since sort of lockdown time where it's actually started to take a toll. The reality that it was getting worse, and that these things that I always knew, and I was diagnosed that I can't remember how many said now, like 1 in 3 people have surgery at some point in their life, and I was like, oh, that's clearly not going to be me, and so it just didn't seem anything that I was worried about, and that obviously grew. I guess like I've always been quite open with talking about stuff, and like you say, actually, all of this does mesh together because as a teacher, I kind of have to be willing to kind of talk about stuff, and I teach
Mm.
biology as well, so I literally actively, where it fits into the curriculum, talk about IBD. I talk about Crohn's and
Perfect.
autoimmune diseases, and I've told them all about what I've been through in the surgeries, and I think I've even at some point afterwards kind of talked about, I got to the point where I was wearing adult nappies, certainly to my sixth form students, where you can have that little bit
Mm.
more extra sort of level of openness with them. Um, and I've done talks at school about men's mental health. I think that's a really important thing. The one that I really liked, one of the podcasts you did recently with Dan Flood, where he talked about it as well. And I think that's
Mm.
one thing that's again kind of driven me. I think with my Instagram is there's not that many guys out there on the platform that are sharing in the way that people like myself or Dan does, and lots of others. And so I think it's
Mm.
important to raise that aspect. So I think as a guy as well, like mental health is something that people tend to shy away from, sort of park it in a
Yeah.
box. But being open and talking about it is really important. Um, and yeah, it's been hard at times. I think the reality of and like now knowing, like I said earlier, that I've got this like fear in the back of my head that it's going to come back. Like I'm not cured. There is no cure to IBD, and certainly when it's Crohn's rather than say UC, where you having the surgery, it's still not cured, but effectively it's kind of removed. But knowing that it's Crohn's and it could come back elsewhere is a worry. But I think I just have to rationalize it in my head and just think, well, if things happen, one, I've got this amazing community, I've got this support network around me now that I can find information from people who have lived it and experienced it, and I know that I can be open about talking about it. There's no, you leave your dignity at the door. So I've seen a lot of people post about recently when you go and see a doctor now when you've got IBD, you just get so used to like I'll just drop your trousers, sir. He's like, oh, fine, whatever. Like, I just don't really care anymore. It's just like, well, fine, because you've been through so much. So yeah, I don't know if I really answered the question but yeah.
It absolutely did answer the question. In terms of, I just wanted to revisit the kind of teaching element of it.
Yeah.
I'm imagining when you were in the kind of throes of Crohn's or Crohn's colitis, whatever it may have been at the time, getting through a day in a classroom must have been really tough because surely you had pretty close calls where you needed to be kind of running in and out of the room to go to the bathroom. What what kind of changed after you had your surgery? Do you feel like it enabled you to really embrace your career and move forward with it? I appreciate that you also had COVID, which would have changed everything anyway. But how much did that kind of change your ability to kind of do your job?
Yeah, so I'm so fortunate, and I was thinking about this a couple of weeks ago actually, because someone posted something and made me think that um, I work at an independent boarding day school, and there are staff housing on site, so I literally live in a house opposite the road from
Wow.
the school. So I've got a 4 minute walk of a commute between my classroom and my house.
Gorgeous.
That's pretty good. Which, to be honest, was absolute saving grace because I think when it was at its worst before the surgery, I was probably running to the toilet 10, 15 times a day, sometimes more. But for me, it was the urgency. Like I got to the point where I would have less than a minute to get to the toilet. From feeling like oh to like literally I'm going to the toilet would be less than a minute. So the amount of times where I wouldn't make it and I'd get to the toilet, but I couldn't like unbuckle my trousers and everything fast enough. And I was having, I had accidents at school. I had accidents. The worst one was walking down the corridor, and I knew I felt bad. All right, it was lunchtime. I just had lunch, and I was walking down the corridor. I got to get home. Got to get home. And I had an accident walking down the corridor to get out, and I literally just had to carry on walking out of the school across the road to my house to then have a shower and get clean. And I just I was just crying. It was just horrible. It was just the most depressing thing. Yeah, the other saving grace was that there's literally a staff toilet like 30 seconds, less than that, around the corner. It's like just out the corridor from my classroom, and there's the toilet. And my school were really good, actually. They were really supportive. So when I got quite bad, I was open with them again, think about mental health and the importance of talking to your employer. I was quite open with Deputy Head Pastoral, who's our sort of welfare officer for staff, and explained what was going on. So they put a lock on the toilet door because I'd had an accident before where I'd gone to the toilet and I was there in time, but someone was in the one and only cubicle, and I won't go into details, but that was the most degrading thing I've ever had to experience, to then let this person out to, and it was, yeah, not nice.
Gosh,
Um,
no.
so that they helped massively by giving me that key. It meant that I had the security. I knew no one was going to be in there, so I could have access to that. So if it wasn't for those two things, I think I would have been signed off work for a long time prior to the surgery. And because of that, potentially that would have accelerated the rate at which I then perhaps had the surgery, or I don't know. It'd be interesting in retrospective sight to, yeah, I have
Good
no
point.
idea what would happen. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I do really feel for people who have, in careers like that where you can't really just leave. Like if I left the classroom, I'd have to go and let, as I say, a science teacher. We've got like technicians. I'd have to shout to the technician, "Can you come and step in?" So there was always somebody in the classroom with the pupils, whilst I would then disappear. And it's embarrassing as well. You've rushed out, and then you've been gone for however long you've been gone, which sometimes could be quite a while, to then come back
Mm.
again. And like, even though they necessarily know what you've been doing, you kind of feel like they do. And yeah, it was hard, and that impacted on my mental health as well. And I think for my GI team, the point at which they were like, right, you're going to speak to the surgeons, is when I rang up my IBD nurse and said, I just can't cope with this anymore. I can't keep doing this. It's too much. I can't. I'm getting a little bit emotional now thinking about it, because yeah, it wasn't life saving, but this surgery was massively life changing for me.
Yeah, I can't imagine how difficult that would have been. Also, children aren't that forgiving all the time. They make comments, they say things, they don't realize what they're doing. So I can imagine that was a difficult audience to be kind of suffering in front of at times anyway. I really feel for you, and I'm really, really thankful that you managed to have the surgery, and I hope that's changed things
Yeah,
enormously.
definitely. So yeah, because you asked about sort of now as well. So yeah, now, I had the Coloplast asked me to do a little advertisement the other day for the bags that I use, the Sensura Mio bags. So I sort of wrote on there on the caption, it's given me comfort and security, and I now don't worry, and I'm not consciously thinking like standing in front of everyone with my stoma bag. Obviously, when it fills up, like you can definitely see that it's there. It's not complete. You
Mm.
can't hide it, and I think the one thing as a guy, one thing I think doesn't get talked about as much, I've tried to raise it a few times, is clothing issues. Because I think for a woman, it's a bit easier. You can wear like a high waisted trousers, or you can wear more of a floaty dress, particularly in a work situation. But working at
Yeah.
the kind of place I do, I have to wear a suit and tie every day. So I have to tuck my shirt in, which then means I've got to have a stoma wrap over the top to kind of keep my bag down. But then that's cut off the volume. So there's all that kind of stuff. So that then it then means as my bag fills up, it becomes more obvious. But actually, I just don't care. They know about it because I've talked about it, because I've made it not a thing. It's just something, sometimes they'll ask about stuff, and it's all right. But yeah, it's totally enabled me to get on with stuff. The one thing that it has changed at work is I'm currently head of department, so I'm head of biology, and then sort of line manage the biology teachers and run the curriculum and do all that kind of stuff. And knowing that it's Crohn's disease, and knowing that stress is what kind of set me to where I am, I made the decision to step down. So as of September, I won't be doing that anymore. I'll be just a classroom teacher. And I'll drop the management aspect, which is a shame, and I kind of was reluctant to do it in a one way, but at the same time, I knew I had to do what was right for me and for my health and my family, because I want to risk it coming back if I can do anything to help that, if I can reduce that risk, because yeah, I don't want to be like, well, I don't want short bowel syndrome. Basically, that's my fear.
Yeah. I'm sorry that you have to think about making trade-offs where you need to in your life. That's not fair, and it shouldn't be like that. However, it sounds like you definitely made the right decision. Like, you know more than anyone, health is wealth. If you don't have that,
Yeah.
anything else doesn't really matter, does it?
Yeah, definitely.
You have mentioned don't know where I saw this. I think I saw it on your Instagram where you said this in a video or maybe a post, but you mentioned a possible link between IBD and disordered eating. I didn't know too much about kind of the context for that, but I've never heard anybody talk about that before, and I thought that was really interesting. I wondered if you wouldn't
Yeah.
mind kind of touching upon that.
So again, links back to the teaching actually. So it was from when I was literally just going back to work. So after the surgery, I'd had all the recovery off, and then fortunately, it was very cleverly planned. In that, then it was then the Easter break, and then we went back to work. So we always have inset teacher training inset on the days
Hmm.
leading up to the start of the new term. And one of the things we were being trained on was eating disorders for pupils, and in terms of what to look out for and sort of what help is available for them. But it was not. It was the difference between disordered eating and eating disorders. And I'd never heard of disordered eating before, and I still don't really know a massive amount about it. But when they were listing off all the kind of symptoms, I sat there and thinking, God, this is very much like what it's like when you've got IBD. Like you do get worried about certain foods, you do get anxiety about what you're eating, you get concerned that if you eat something that then it's going to make you more ill or it's going to cause a flare up, and so you stop eating or you eat too much and then you binge eat because you didn't eat before. And I sort of like, this is really similar. There's definitely a link. And I asked the question, and they were useless to be honest. They didn't have a clue. And to the point where they were like, "Oh no, I've never heard of that," and then almost flipped it around and were like, "Oh, sometimes we find people who have had like eating disorders develop gastro problems." Like, no, I'm saying that there's a link the other way. That if you've got a gastro problem,
Mm.
like you do get worried about food. Like, and again, like I've not really experienced it massively myself because I said food was never really too much of an issue for me. I knew to stay away from like fresh pineapple and baked beans and anything that was going to make me really gassy. But other than that, wasn't an issue. I think for me more, it's been since having the stoma. I'm really quite cautious about what I'm eating. I'm fearing a blockage. I haven't had one yet. If I have, it was like I got admitted not that long ago, um, during the recovery from the last surgery, actually, where I'd had really high output through my stoma, and I think I passed about 2.5 liters through my stoma bag over about 14 hours, and I'd been sick 3 times, so it was just like, hmm. And when I looked up all the symptoms, and potentially could have been a partial blockage. It's unusual if you have high output, but you can potentially get that. It's
Mm.
normally obviously you don't have any output, so it was unusual. But obviously went in and they weren't sure what it all was. But I'm really worried about getting blockages. Like again, you hear of like how painful it can be and how long it can be, debilitating it can be, and then what is actually the end product? What you have to go through to, some people have to have all sorts of procedures done, NG tubes and things to flush stuff, and I've heard of people having to have all sorts of different things done, and or just time and waiting for it to pass. So I'm slowly getting better at introducing different foods. It's been interesting. I did a post. I just posted a picture of a sort of stir fry that I made the other day, and that got quite a few responses in terms of like, "Oh, you're so lucky to be able to eat that," and blah blah blah. If I ate that with my stoma, I'd be too worried. And I thought, oh, this is definitely like this is a thing. Like it's you can't eat normally when you've got IBD or even I think some people with stoma are great and they don't worry about it, and I am getting better. It's that slow reintroduction of stuff, but it's definitely I think it's definitely a link. And there was a lot of people responded and they sort of implied themselves that they thought there was definitely a link there and they struggled with different things.
Yeah, I think just to touch upon what they had said to you at the same time, that they felt that people who had eating disorders had gastric issues. It's really interesting. I would say 70 to 80% of the female guests that I have had on this podcast were told they had an eating disorder before they were diagnosed with either Crohn's or colitis. Every single one. And that's people who are in their teens now. And that's also someone I had on the other day who's in her 60s, and they all got told the same thing at the beginning. So there's definitely there's definitely something going on in terms of the relationship between those two things. And I do think it's quite different depending on your gender as to what they tell you that you have at the beginning, which
Yeah.
is interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
I wondered if we could just talk about this kind of invisible illness bucket and what your views are in terms of kind of what it's like to live with an invisible illness, what those challenges look like, and how you might be able to overcome them.
So again, I think this is different on everyone's story. What kind of symptoms you're suffering from? For me, my when I was at my worst, my issues were urgency. They were bleeding. They were not making it to the toilet in time. The frequency, amount of time I was going, the amount of time I was then stuck in the toilet, um, and I also then was starting to get fatigue and muscle joint pains, particularly in my knees, and I'd go and look quite pale again and sort of really sort of sunken eyes. And I didn't see it at the time. It wasn't until I kind of went back to work and everyone was like, someone described me as like, they said you were like a zombie, like you would like shuffle down the corridor like a zombie. And I was like, ugh. And then I kind of reflected and thought, everyone would ask, how are you? Are you all right? And you knew it was always a loaded question. Because I say I've been really open about it. I talked to all my colleagues about it as well. Like they all know because I think for me, having an invisible illness, the only way I can get people to understand is by voicing it and telling people what I'm going through, because that's the only way that you're going to get any understanding. Otherwise, if you don't, no one's going to understand. They can't understand. You'll just be like, well, why are you pulling out of this event, and why aren't you coming here, and why won't you come out on this day out, and why are you tired all the time? Whereas at least if you're open and honest about it, then people can rationalize it. And sometimes it takes numerous conversations till they can actually understand. That's why I think, the work that we all do on various social platforms that Crohn's colitis do to raise awareness actually of what it's like to have an invisible illness and what that means is really important.
I have two more questions, then I promise I'm going to let you go. But I'm really enjoying this. I'm going to drag it out a tiny bit longer. You mentioned that you had two children.
Yeah.
I don't know how old they are now. I think you said one was really young during the pandemic. But I wondered if you had been asked by them about your stoma or had an opportunity to kind of introduce it to them, and if so, how you went about doing that.
Yeah, so they are now 7, and the youngest one will be 5 next month. So they're old enough to kind of definitely know. I was I showed them stuff beforehand so that they knew what my body would look like, so that they could see a stoma before.
Yeah.
Showed them like when I got the trial bags and stuff, and so I sort of tried those on because stoma nurses give you stuff to try on. So showed them what it would look like. And I just was quite open about them. And to be honest, they're young kids. I can be going to the toilet, emptying my stoma bag, and they'll just burst in like halfway through opening it. So yeah, there's there's no sort of secrets at all really. But it'll be it's interesting that the older one, the first time they couldn't come into the ward at all. They didn't get to see me at all whilst I was in hospital with my first op. And the second one, technically they shouldn't have been allowed on the ward, but someone nice let them in. And the Freya, my oldest, was definitely hesitant seeing me in the hospital bed with tubes coming in and out of me and like quite gingerly moving. And she was really unusually quiet and reserved. So yeah, it's definitely it can be interesting and hard sometimes to sort of explain to young children, but now they just see it as any anything else. And the main thing I have to do is try and stop my son jumping all over my tummy all the time. And just like, you have to watch my stoma. You can't jump on my tummy.
Ripped your bag off in the middle
Yeah,
of playing.
it's more just jumping on me is the issue, and then you just think, oh god, squash it or something. Not that you can squash a stoma, of course, but yeah.
Ben, I have one final question, and it's the one that we ask everybody right at the end, which is, what would you say to anyone who has stoma surgery coming up? What might they expect, and what should they be aware of?
Okay, so I think the big thing that I would suggest is find out find out some real stories, connect with people who have been through it. Particularly, I think people who have been through it quite recently, whilst stuff is fresh in their memory as well. So yeah, look out for people. It's difficult for me. What I think the challenge, what like I felt, was if you're not on social media, it's all right, like having the audience that we've got here today is probably people that know Ostique possibly through social media more so than anywhere else, and so they're already kind of there as a captive audience. So how do you reach out to the wider audience? But yeah, just trying to sort of get that real world experience. I think you've got to accept there's going to be pain. The initial recovery is hard. You've just had lots of abdominal muscles cut, and so you're stiff and you're achy, and bending is hard. You're likely to go through patches where you don't like the way you look, or you don't mind the way you look, and sometimes you can just be irritated by your stoma bag. Like, I have days still where I just wished it wasn't there and just was like, just want to rip it off and get rid of it. But it's there and it does a job, and it's enabled me to get on and have a life. And I think that's the other thing to remember for anyone going through it. Like, there will be dark times, and first, everyone's story is different. This is amazing. I've supported a few people going through it now who have reached out to me and asked me questions, and following their journey and looking at stuff that they've gone through is different to what I've gone through. So everyone is different, but yeah, there's going to be blips. There's going to be bits that are going to be challenging, and it takes time to come to terms with who you now are. And for me, it's interesting. Like, I kind of, at the moment, I did a post about this the other day. I kind of define myself by my stoma, really, at the moment. I feel like it's such an important part of my persona now, because it's meant so much to me in terms of my positivity and my outlook, and the ability it's now given me to have a better life and to do stuff. And also, it's made me a better person. Like, I'm more aware of people with disabilities and difficulties in their life, and I've been more active in actually reaching out and helping people, which I hadn't been before. So I think you're going to get all sorts of different benefits out of it. But yeah, everyone's journey is different, but go into it with a positive mindset, and I think it'll make a huge difference to you.
Ben, thank you so much for being here. I know we've gone a little bit over the time I said, but as I mentioned, I really enjoyed chatting to you. Thank you for telling your story.
No, thank you so much. I'm a massive fan of the podcast, so I've been a bit like sort of fanboying for weeks now in the build up to this. I did a post the other day where I was just sort of on the camera. I felt excited. So yeah, for anyone that saw my story the other day, this was it. This was the exciting stoma related thing that I was excited about.
Oh, I'm so glad. Maybe we'll have you on again in the future, and we could talk about something else as well.
Brilliant. Fab. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
See
Liv.
you soon.
Bye.
Bye. Have you seen the new Ostique skins yet? Ostique skins are revolutionary ostomy pouch covers that were created to make the wearer feel confident, sexy and powerful in all of life's moments. From moments of intimacy to lounging by the pool, conquering a workout or simply heading out to lunch, skins have you covered. Even better, they're compatible with all major colostomy and ileostomy bags. Ostique skins are available in a range of colours and skin tones, and they're made from a revolutionary material that's completely waterproof, high quality, soft and comfortable. Skins are easy to use, even with reduced dexterity, and they work with both closed and drainable bags. Plus, skins are also environmentally friendly and vegan. There are 4 bundles available to buy now, and you can also purchase individual skins. Head to ostique.co.uk to find out more.